Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening and welcome to the World Affairs Council program on the elections in Thailand, our foreign policy panel series discussion. My name is Heidi Shoup and I'm president of the World Affairs Council. On behalf of the board and Global Advisory Council, I welcome you all here this evening. Our foreign policy series tonight is Thai elections, what happens next? We have with us three experts who will help us dissect that question. First, Dr. Karl Jackson, who's sitting in the middle there, is Director of Southeast Asia Studies and is a CV Star Distinguished Professor of Southeast Asia Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He has served as President of the U.S.-Thailand Business Council, as well as Senior Director for Asia on the National Security Council and as Executive Vice President of the International Finance Corporation. He has also served as U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia and the Pacific. Greg Poling is a fellow at the Sumitro Chair for Southeast Asia Studies and the Pacific Partners Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Poling manages projects that analyze U.S. foreign policy in Asia with a focus on countries that are members of ASEAN. Mr. Poling is the author of The South China Sea in Focus, Clarifying the Limits of Maritime Dispute. Our moderator is Dr. Meredith Weiss, serves as an associate professor at the University of Albany, State University of New York, and is currently a visiting associate professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. She has authored 2 books on the Malaysian political and civil society relationship. Her research has led her to address many facets of Southeast Asian political sphere, including electoral change in the region. She has served as the chair of the Southeast Asia Council of the Association for ASEAN Studies, as well as numerous positions in the American Political Science Association. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel.
Thanks, and thanks to all of you for brushing aside the dire forecasts to come this evening. Once upon a time, in a place far warmer and less snowy than this, there was a man named Thaksin Shinawatra. Some people thought he was very, very good. Others thought precisely the opposite. They put it to a vote several times, and yet the battle continued on. And that's why we're here today. Not entirely. But the contest embodied in the most recent and most mangled of Thai elections represents the latest stage in a drama stretching back over a decade to when Thaksin was first elected Prime Minister of Thailand in 2001, and especially to his ouster by a bloodless military coup in 2006. It is his sister, Yingluck Shinawatra, who has recently governed Thailand under the latest incarnation of Thaksin's Thai Rak Thai Party, now renamed the Pheu Thai Party. Yet, as our panelists this evening will elaborate, to pin this all on Thaksin, however commonly done in the media and in commentary, oversimplifies the case. Thaksin, the man, has come to represent a much larger, much more pervasive split within Thai politics and society. In very broad terms, since I have 5 minutes to sum up the entire past political history of Thailand, Thaksin, a U.S.-educated former high-ranking police officer and telecommunications tycoon, cultivated strong support as prime minister, particularly among the rural and poor masses in Thailand's north and northeast, by way of anti-poverty measures, infrastructure development, and populist policies such as a much-touted program for essentially healthcare for all. At the same time, he generated vehement opposition, especially in and around Bangkok and Thailand's south, for his perceived corruption, his authoritarian leanings, human rights abuses, economically inefficient policies, insensitive, if not utterly inept, handling of a long-running insurgency among southern Muslims, his free trade agenda, and especially for his seeming lack of deference to Thailand's revered king. 2 camps pro-Thaksin so-called red shirts and monarchists' yellow shirts developed. The membership and monikers of those camps have shifted over time, but the basic dynamics have remained fairly constant. Waves of protest have paralyzed Bangkok almost annually since 2006, punctuated by several changes of government. The latest iteration, sparked last October largely by an amnesty bill that Prime Minister Yingluck unwisely tried to get through Parliament that would exonerate her brother, among others, has been stark in its rhetoric. So it's Yingluck's elected or, if need be, re-elected government on the one side, or, as articulated by Sumitro Chair and others in the People's Democratic Reform Committee, the yellow shirts, suspension of electoral rule, and instead government by an appointed council of good people for the time being. While Thai Rak Thai, Thaksin's party, has been banned since 2007, its successors have won elections in 2007 and 2011, with an interregnum under yellow shirt Abhisit Vejjajiva after one of those parties was dissolved for fraud and its leaders barred from politics in 2008. Reports suggest that Pheu Thai would again have won elections that were held 10 days ago had those elections been allowed to proceed nationwide. But in fact, amidst yet another Bangkok shutdown, not only did the opposition Democrat Party boycott the polls, but protesters kept candidates from nominating themselves and voters from casting votes across much of the country. Polling will resume, supposedly, in late April. For now, Thailand is left again in political limbo. As for what comes next, I will turn things over to our panelists, Karl and Greg.
Rather than delve more into how we got here, I'd like to look a bit more closely at the last few months. What we've seen is a standoff between one party in Thailand who has, I think, used majoritarian rule, used an electoral majority as a cudgel, and made the political minority feel that the democratic system no longer offers it a viable way to power. The amnesty bill was certainly the most incautious thing that Prime Minister Yingluck did during her 18 months or so in power, and it was the final straw for the Democrat Party and the anti-Thaksin faction, widely known as Yellow Shirts, or at least formerly Yellow Shirts. But it wasn't the only straw. I think this was a slow build to the idea that they could not, in the way that they are used to operating over most of the 20th century, get back to power. It's worth noting that after Thaksin was overthrown in 2006, the courts and the elites, with the backing of the military, wrote a new constitution that, in my opinion, probably has the most safeguards for the political minority that you could imagine in a democratic system. You have a Senate that is partially or half appointed by the judiciary. You have organs of power from the Election Commission to the courts to the Anti-Corruption Commission that are outside the reach of the electorate, specifically for the purpose of protecting the power of the old guard. If you imagine the current system here in the United States and how difficult it can be for the majority to get things through the Senate, the Thai system, I think, is meant to protect the political minority even more. So even given all those protections, the Democrats still felt that they were being beaten over the head by this electoral mandate of Yingluck and the Pheu Thai party. So what was the option? The option was to take to the streets. And that's where you get this, what to American ears sounds very ironic and a bit like doublespeak, where they say that they're trying to bring down the electoral system to save democracy. In their minds, democracy has been cheapened. It's become simple majoritarianism, which has led to a tyranny of the masses, so to speak. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think what's really at work here and what we've seen is a political class in Bangkok, represented by the Democrats, who spent the better part of the 20th century comfortably fighting factional and court politics. The masses didn't have to be listened to, especially the North and the Northeast. What Thaksin did was overthrow that system. He created a political base that had never really been part of the system before. And the Democrats are still trying to come to grips with how they compete in a genuinely democratic Thailand. They're not used to having to worry about party platforms. They're not used to having to worry about really politicking and pounding the pavement to get votes. They're used to working in backroom deals with factions of the military, the business elite, the court elite, and getting them to bring voters to the polls and vote for them. This is a whole new kind of Thailand, and it's going through the growing pains that I think you would expect. That doesn't mean that it's not a real threat. This is precisely why you've had 10 years of almost constant chaos, coup after coup, be it military or judicial. Thailand desperately needs to find a new equilibrium. And that means that the Democrats and the elites they represent need to accept that they live in a new world, that the wheel of history has turned, and they need to get used to the idea that you actually have to compete for votes, and not just in half of the country, but in all of the country. It also means that the Shinawatra clan, currently represented by Prime Minister Yingluck, formerly her brother Thaksin, probably no longer need to be on the scene. They have become a poison that the political minority is never going to accept. And the way they ruled brought this about. They really did use their power as a club. They ignored political opposition. They went outside the parliamentary system whenever they could. They were certainly corrupt, though whether or not more corrupt than their predecessors is a highly contested opinion. But they need to learn, both sides of this, that a democracy is about compromise, not about I have the most votes, therefore I have a mandate to do absolutely anything I want. To look more specifically, though, at what's happened on the elections, as Meredith pointed out, you had the protesters in the streets, which on some days numbered over 100,000, blocking polling places, occupying government ministries, essentially trying to make the country ungovernable. Given that situation and the frankly thuggery that we saw during early voting, that they used to keep hundreds of thousands of Thais from voting, from casting ballots, I thought it was somewhat impressive that 46% of the electorate actually managed to cast ballots on February 2nd. If you lived in Bangkok, only a quarter of the Bangkok electorate cast ballots. That's a quarter of the people who went out on the street knowing full well that they risked a pretty good chance of being physically accosted, possibly being killed, being seriously injured. Just a week earlier, they had watched on national television as people were beaten. The day before the elections, they watched a shootout in downtown Bangkok. It's impressive that that many Thais actually felt that casting a vote and defending the system was worth risking physical harm. And that's 46%, including the fact that 9 provinces were entirely shut down from voting, and polls across much of the South and the capital were partially shut down. So when you really look at the numbers, and we don't know, we're not going to know until April when they hold make-up elections and they finally release initial results, but clearly a significant majority of Thais went out on February 2nd and either voted or tried to vote. You add to that those who would have voted if they weren't frightened, you have a very significant majority of Thais who, whether or not they disagree with this government, clearly do not agree with taking to the streets and physically preventing fellow citizens from casting a ballot. That is, in a sense, a hopeful sign. It's also, I think, the reason that we shouldn't expect an outright military coup like we did in 2006. That was clearly the prominent fear among many Thais, and here in the U.S., that we would witness another military coup in a treaty ally, which, if you've been following events in Egypt, say, that's very uncomfortable for the U.S. when a treaty ally has a military coup. All kinds of legal ramifications follow. I don't think that'll happen. The top generals, including Army Chief Prayut Chan-o-cha, have made it clear that they don't want that. Prayut, after the elections, came out and said that nobody's going to bully him into a coup. More importantly, Prayut allowed himself to be filmed on February 2nd casting a ballot, which in Thailand, everything is a sign and everything's a subtle message to other factions of the government, and casting a ballot said, I might not like Yingluck, I certainly didn't like her brother, but I like the chaos you're causing and the black eye you're giving us in the international arena just as much. What we do have to worry about is a judicial coup or an administrative coup, however you want to call it. As I said, the current constitution is one that stacks the deck, in a sense, against the electoral majority. There are plenty of organs of government with the power to completely topple the system. Far more organs of government than should be able to topple the system. One hurdle was jumped just yesterday when the Constitutional Court said they're not going to overturn the election results. That's a good thing. There is still the Anti-Corruption Commission to deal with. The National Anti-Corruption Commission is currently seeking impeachment proceedings against the Prime Minister. over charges that she prevented state losses in a rice buying scheme, with no evidence that I'm aware of that she directly was involved in corruption, arguing that some within her ministry were involved with corruption, and more importantly, they cost the state money. Even more ridiculous, they have proceedings right now against essentially the entire lower house of parliament, charging them with corruption in the way they tried to pass an amendment to the Constitution to make the Senate completely elected. That is, I think, laughable in many Western eyes. An anti-corruption commission is supposed to charge people who are caught taking bribes, not charge people who try to amend the Constitution in a way you don't like. But what we've seen is that these organs of government, by and large, have proven themselves opposed to this government, certainly. And part of the reason that I think the Electoral Commission, who originally said that new balloting for advanced voting would take place at the end of this month and then they would release results, have now said they're going to wait until late April, is because they figure by late April the problem might have solved itself if they can give the Anti-Corruption Commission time to unseat the government for them. And then the Election Commission doesn't have to wait for it. That's the biggest fear. If that happens, then we're right back where we were just a few years ago when you had the Democrats in power, despite having never won an election, having never really even come close, and having no legitimacy. We will have red shirts supportive of Thaksin and his sister back on the streets. We'll have violence again. It might not be as bad as it got in 2010 when almost 100 people were killed on the streets of Bangkok, but it'll certainly be a reset on this cycle of chaos. And what the Democrats need to accept, and what their allies on the streets right now need to accept, is that even if they win this battle, they're going to lose the war. As I said earlier, history has turned on them. The electorate, especially in the north, is no longer willing to accept their second-class status in Thailand. So you might topple this government, and you might cause a few more dozens of deaths and maybe a few more years of Thailand being the laughingstock of the region as neighbors like Burma or Myanmar are becoming democracies. But in the end, you're going to find yourself right back here, whether it's in a year or 2 years or 5 years. And that's, from the U.S. angle, clearly the messaging I think they've been getting from the embassy in Bangkok, as well as from the White House and the State Department here. It's your problems, you work it out, but come on, you're Thailand, you're a middle-income country, you're, for the most part, a democracy. You're embarrassing yourselves in the eyes of the region. You're no longer able to govern. We won't have a functioning government until at least the middle of the year. This is just a caretaker government that can't pass legislation, can't pass budgets, can't even attend meetings with other foreign heads of states. This is a country that is missing, and it's a traditional leader within Asia that at this time, given the U.S. pivot, given a rising China, its leadership is desperately needed, and it's desperately missing. And with that, I think I'll turn my time over to Karl.
All right. I'd like to begin by looking backwards at just how difficult this task is that Thailand faces. Consolidating democracies is hard work. It's very time-consuming. It is often chaotic and frequently bloody. Examples abound. I've once heard that there was something called the United States of America. We started with Articles of Confederation, which were unworkable. We then turned to a constitution in 1789, but then we sort of fell off the wagon ever so slightly between 1861 and 1865 and had a civil war that makes what's occurring in Syria look like a tea party. No pun intended on the Tea Party, sorry. But my point is that if you look very deeply at this process, this is difficult stuff. On the 14th of July in 1789, a crowd marched on the Bastille. And eventually, France did achieve a consolidated, stable government in 1958. This can be a long time process involving multiple changes in government and multiple instances of blood in the streets. It is only a few years ago that I used to give courses which talked about Thailand as the poster boy of democratic consolidation in Southeast Asia. So Indonesia, best beware. That is, those countries that are today's poster boys can become quite the opposite. Why? Because at a mass level, the amount of support for democracy is inchoate and thin. At the elite level, elites, in order to achieve democratic consolidation, have to trust one another. Democracy, after all, is an illogical thing. The idea that I, as the government, should leave power simply because a bunch of people upcountry who are not as smart or well-educated as I am vote against me is illogical. At least that's what I think large numbers of people within the Bangkok elite believe. Elites write constitutions, they make rules, they create upper houses that are designed to protect the rights of the minority, and they also dictate the standards for civility, or the lack of civility, on the streets of the capital city. Usually, in the long run, Thailand has a solution to this problem. And it's usually one of two. Either His Majesty the King stands up and says, as he did in May of 1992, go back to your corners, both of you, and stop ruining my kingdom. The other alternative is called a military coup, which has happened numerous times since 1932. There is, however, a third alternative. The third alternative is that Yingluck's barely legitimate, wounded government staggers onward. I do not think that's sustainable in the long term. It may be sustainable for several months. The problem is that the normal Thai solution to this problem, a bloodless military coup, is not an option that the Thai military wishes to exercise. It's certainly not the preferred option of the Thai military. Why? Because in 2006, when they did this, they discovered the 1950s have ended. It is not easy to run Thailand. Thailand is a big, complex country. Or as they say, this is not your father's Oldsmobile. Well, this is not your father's Thailand. And the military found itself fundamentally discomfited in that role. Secondly, the army can read voting statistics. And they know that if they take power directly, they are overturning at least the wishes of a bare majority, and perhaps a substantial majority, at least if that majority had been allowed to vote. Third, the army watches television. And no one would like to get into the middle of that street theater that is being performed daily in the city of Bangkok between the yellow shirts on the one hand and the red shirts on the other. And the fourth reason I think the military is reluctant to intervene directly this time is a judicial coup is much preferable. It's much better to have somebody else do the job, and my guess is that there will be a judicial coup. It will involve the rice buying scheme of the Yingluck Shinawatra government, which was a truly mindless scheme to begin with. The yellow shirts will hopefully lose steam. There will be a judicial coup, but the real question is what happens right after that? Do we go back to 1992, where His Majesty names a prime minister, in that case, Anand Panyanarachun, and a government is constituted for a year in preparation for an election. That's one possibility. But it seems to me that's really difficult because of the fact that most people understand that even if a year goes by and even if the government, the appointed government, is truly immaculate, it will not make a difference. That is, the permanent constituency of Thai Rak Thai or Puya Thai, whatever the various titles are, is the awkward political fact for the elite. So you have a zero-sum game in which you have one sizable element that rejects one man, one vote popular sovereignty as a concept, and its view of democracy is democracy should be clean and should also be one that we can control. We, the reformers, can control because we know better. The other concept of democracy is the Thaksin style democracy that features populist redistribution schemes, whether or not they work, as well as continuing large-scale corruption. The problem is there is no longer an authoritative figure that can hold the center, that can bring the compromise in the way that His Majesty, the King, in the past has done. All of the divisions that exist within the elite have become personalized and vitriolic. There is no political space in the center of the Thai political spectrum. Forceful leadership is required, and none is available to forge such a compromise. So where do we go from here? There's always the possibility that cooler heads will prevail, that you could conceive of several different stratagems that could take place. Maybe have a constitutional convention, and draft as part of it binding conflict of interest laws to control the future Huey Long-like characters. Thaksin Shinawatra-like characters, and binding anti-corruption statutes. But the problem with this is that those would then apply to the Democrats if they got back into power. Perhaps you create an elected Senate with large constituencies, and you finagle with the rules of government to create, in effect, a bicameral legislature rather than a unicameral one. It's possible to conceive of ways where political engineering could help. However, the idea that you're going to banish not just Thaksin Shinawatra, but his sister, their children, their families, I doubt that that's really sustainable. First of all, I don't know Thaksin really well. I've met with him 3 or 4 times, but this is pretty tough character. This is not a person who accepts being thrown out into the alley like a stray cat. And I think that some way must be found, if you're going to have any kind of a compromise, to give things to the yellow shirts and give things to the red shirts. And the one thing that I thought of that perhaps might be acceptable to Thaksin himself was that if he were allowed to return to Thailand under a suspended sentence from his corruption conviction, and if that sentence would be executed if he ever got himself involved in politics again, then he conceivably might agree to do this. Why do I think that? Because I once sat with him and tried to get him to accept that deal, and he said yes. This was 3 or 4 years ago, right after the coup of 2006. There needs to be some kind of a compromise. What the exact outlines of it should be remains only for Thais to figure out. And I guess the one thing I would suggest to people who make policy in this town is the part of the Hippocratic Oath that says, above all, do no harm. And it is only Thais who really can sort this mess out. They made it, and they have to sort it out. And their friends, and I would certainly count myself as one of them, can only sit on the sidelines and quietly offer advice.
Thanks for both of your sets of remarks. We'll move into a Q&A, and I'll kick things off with a question for each of you, except with the caveat that I'm somewhat arbitrarily deciding to whom to direct each of these questions, so feel free to switch. So
You be arbitrary?
I know, it's shocking. Yeah, it's the spirit of the times. So for Greg, you mentioned the extent to which Thailand at this point may seem the laughing stock of ASEAN in terms of being the one country that's been so much backtracking on the whole progress of democratic consolidation. At the same time, ASEAN is moving toward an intended political union that should be tighter than before as of next year. And some of this is just discursive hype, but some of this should be reality. In the ASEAN statements about political and the political community toward which they aim next year, 2015, there are paeans to democracy and towards supporting rule of law and democratic governance in ASEAN member states, despite the longstanding norm of non-interference. So do you think at some point ASEAN and some guys will step in, whether to try to encourage some sort of settlement or actually to sanction Thailand for violating those norms in the policy statements? And then for Karl, again, noting that either of you can really answer either of these. To some extent, the conflict in Thailand is far more legible at the level of elites than at the level of masses. In other words, we can see who the main players are, partly because there are a number of media moguls among them. They use media well. There are published statements by these different leaders, Thaksin, Suthep, all of the others. And yet much of what's actually happened involves these massive grassroots protests in Bangkok and elsewhere. A number of recent studies by the Asia Foundation, by various scholars, by others, have attempted to gauge who really constitute these two camps. Who are the yellow shirts? Who are the red shirts? Are they just stooges of Thaksin or of others? Or are these rational actors coming out to protest over their own personal interests? Mixed in with this, we have the conduct of the elections, which, as Greg noted, probably did harden some opinions, but amongst those who wanted to vote, not because they're on one side or the other, but because they like the idea of voting. So who do you see as being the main opinion leaders below that top level of elites, or the main force that will likely direct elite opinion or direct elite actions? In other words, will the rice farmers who are now protesting, will they become a key constituency as we move forward toward some sort of reform? And I completely agree that it's hard to imagine what those reforms might be. Or will this be a question of this semi-mythical Bangkok middle class, which is hardly so cohesive as accounts tend to assume? Will they be the ones who really set the agenda? In other words, to what ground will the next round of elites likely turn?
I'll
Pick your pick.
Sure, I'll hop in on the first question. I guess
You took the easy
I'll
one.
answer it. I tell you what,
Pretty smart guy.
I'll compromise. I'll see what you say, and then I'll jump in and say I agree. Working backwards on the ASEAN, will ASEAN do anything about Thailand? I don't think so. As you say, ASEAN is slowly inching away from its founding norms of non-interference and respect for sovereignty, but not to the level of sanctioning a member. They will quietly, friend to friend, tell Thailand to get it together. That's about the most you can expect. the bigger question of how Thailand's democratic, let's call it backtracking, affects ASEAN unity is interesting because, in my opinion, the biggest obstacle to ASEAN, greater ASEAN unity and the establishment of the ASEAN community is the ineffectiveness of ASEAN itself, the ineffectiveness of the Secretariat. ASEAN, by people who are only vaguely familiar with it, gets touted as some kind of nascent EU for Southeast Asia, but it's not that. It's intentionally weak. And in order to have a real political and economic community, it requires a strong unifying institution. Over the last really 10 years, but you could go back 20 years, there have been voices within ASEAN calling for strengthening the organization, promoting new rules, new norms, including democracy and human rights, and those have been the democratic members of ASEAN. Indonesia is really carrying that flag right now, with some help from Singapore, but Thailand for a long time was the big promoter of ASEAN unity, of ASEAN as a strong institution. And Thailand's absence from ASEAN right now is very noticeable, I think. You have a lot of the less developed, newer members of ASEAN, in particular in Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, to a lesser degree Vietnam, who don't necessarily want to see the organization strengthened because the organization's, as Meredith pointed out, is now promoting things like democracy and human rights. Lined up against that are the bigger, richer, more democratic members, and Thailand is a crucial swing vote in that development of ASEAN. So just recently we've seen on big issues like the South China Sea, Thailand is missing. Thailand is right now the ASEAN coordinator for relations with China. It is supposed to be the interlocutor for all ASEAN discussions with China. There is no more important relationship for ASEAN right now, and for the next year, your interlocutor for China is legally unable to send its head of state to ASEAN meetings. That's not a good sign for an organization that 1 year from now claims it's going to be a unified economic and political community.
I think to sum up his answer, the answer is no.
Yeah, yeah.
The second question, that is, where are the sort of mass bases of the politics that is being enacted on various television sets by media moguls, et cetera, is a much more difficult question. My own research over the last decade, not only in Thailand, but also in the Philippines and also in Jakarta, shows that that if you're expecting that there should be a coherent, informed, large blocks of and groupings of voters, you're looking for them in the wrong part of the world. They don't exist. There isn't a coherent Bangkok middle class. There hasn't been. It is only something that is trotted out as a means of summarizing the day's events in whatever the newspaper or television broadcast is. If you look at it over time, there is very little coherence in the base. Let me give you an illustration. In a survey that we did at SAIS back in 2011, just before Yingluck's election victory, we asked respondents to tell us what they thought about having various forms of government. And you'll be pleased to know that 79% of this national sample said that having a democratic system is either very good or fairly good. 79%. And that made me feel very good until I looked at the other part of the question, which said, what do you think about having a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament or elections? And 62% said that was either very good or good. How about having experts make all the decisions for the country? In effect, a technocracy. Well, 55% were in favor of that. And the one that made me a little bit more optimistic, but I would emphasize only a little bit, were the 43%, that is, it was only 43% who said that having army rule was either good or very good. Now, there are large groups of people who are, the largest group of people are the people who are unclear about the choice between democracy and authoritarian rule. The small groups of people are the perfect Democrats who would say no to 3 of the questions and yes to 1. And there's also a small group who are perfect authoritarians who say yes to 3 and no to democracy. But the mass in the middle is what is up for grabs politically. And it will, in my opinion, not be mobilized by social cleavages, because Thai politics hasn't worked that way. And instead, it will tend to be mobilized by particular leaders and by the charismatic appeal of particular leaders. And the most glaring problem facing the yellow shirts is the best charismatic leader in town is on the other side. He may not be in the country, but he has a remarkable ability to convince poor rice farmers and poor people that even though he's a billionaire, he's just like them. I mean, now that's someone who could sell refrigerators in Alaska, right? And Thaksin has that ability. His sister's is not a slouch at it either. She was a good candidate. And so in the absence of a polity motivated by clear social cleavages, it seems to me, charismatic appeal, the appeal of particular leaders is terribly important. And but they are very hard to produce. And the other side, that is the people who are most disturbed by Thaksin populism, have yet to produce a real competitor. Abhisit was not a real competitor. He couldn't go up country when he was prime minister without a heavy security detail. He was despised up country. And when the vote came out in 2011, that made it clear that that was the case.
Recently, Professor Thitinan Pongsudhirak wrote an article in the Bangkok Post where he said that the election was interesting in the fact that it was the first time that a political party aligned with Thaksin or under his control to varying degrees did not win outright. And he closes his argument by saying, Thai democracy can be made the ultimate winner if previous electoral losers realize that they can actually win future elections by working harder and playing within the rules of the game. And I'm wondering, is there any indication that elites within the Democrat Party and their allies are getting this new reality? And perhaps this is some small indicator that they should adjust. Is there any indication of that actually happening?
I know of no such evidence. But in order to be able to garner such evidence, you'd have to be in Bangkok right now, making the rounds well, first of all, meeting with the most important group in Bangkok, SAIS. That is the group of former students who some of them are on the red side, some of them are on the yellow side, but they all trust one another enough to meet and discuss these things in an open way. And it's a great treat, at least for me, to go back there and have sort of a group of people who can articulate both sides. But I doubt whether or not after all that has happened, after Thaksin's nominees have won and re-won elections, that there's a group within the Democrat Party who thinks they can actually win something other than the south and part of Bangkok, unfortunately. So I would disagree with Thitinan, my good friend and colleague, to that extent. But I must say, it is hard to find a silver lining in this particular cloud, which is what he was trying to do.
I'm not going to outright disagree. I will be slightly more optimistic because it's a fool's errand, I think, to sit here in Washington and disagree completely with Professor Thitinan. He's probably the best Thailand watcher within Thailand at the moment. I agree there is nobody within the Democrat Party who seems willing to accept that the right way to be in opposition is to be in opposition in the legislature, not on the streets. That said, in addition to Pheu, 49 parties contested the elections on February 2nd, and the vast majority of those are led by former Democrats who jumped ship over the last few years for precisely that reason. There are others, there are plenty of business moguls who are out there just to get a little piece of the cronyism pie and score some government contracts, but there are legitimate former Democratic lawmakers who have grown enormously in popularity, guys who were barely known to anybody, who are now not necessarily household names, but among the well-read in Bangkok, becoming household names for saying precisely this, that we hate this government, we hate Thaksinism, we hate the corruption that the regime brought, but the way to be an opponent is in the legislature, not by taking to the streets. And at least within the mythical middle class of Bangkok, you hear more people in this election than I think you ever have saying that they're casting votes for the third parties, precisely in the hopes that now that the Democrats have committed political suicide, should this government limp on, they have committed suicide. Their entire leadership has now forfeited legitimacy in the eyes of any voters who weren't already hardcore Democrat voters, and they're constitutionally banned from office. So there has never been a better time to be a third-party politician in Thailand. That said, you still have a remarkably long shot. But if you look at it, next year, will there be a new non-Pheu Thai, non-Democrat party in government? Absolutely not. But 10 years from now, we might look back and say that some of these parties planted the seeds of Thailand's first real loyal opposition.
Can I just ask a follow-up to that, which is these startup parties could do one of two things. One would be simply redirect support from the Democrat Party, especially when the Democrat Party boycotts. The other would be to poach support from Pheu Thai or offer an alternative for would-be Pheu Thai voters. And one of the arguments I was hearing the last time I was in Bangkok right before the shutdown was that numerically, Pheu Thai of course would win just because we're looking at two parties, Pheu Thai and Democrat, and one has a lot more supporters than the other. So which do you think it's more likely to be? Will these be parties that supplant the Democrat Party, or will they be parties that fragment the base of Pheu Thai from what you've seen so far?
At the moment, they are clearly poaching Democrat voters who believe in the system and do not care for Thaksin, and think that the Democrats have sold their souls over this zero-sum game that they've made Thai politics into. But you do hear whisperings that there are plenty of folks in the north, especially rice farmers, who are now not getting the payments they were promised from these populist policies that got them to elect Thaksin and his sister in the first place, who are looking for an alternative. So again, over 5 to 10 years, over 2 or 3 election cycles, there could be plenty of voters who are looking for alternatives and see it in these parties, but not in 2014, no.
Right.
To me, still the most disturbing aspect is the absence of comity within the Thai elite. The degree to which these divisions have become highly personal and vitriolic is the aspect that disturbs me the most, because Thailand in the old days before Thaksin created a new form of politics in Thailand was very much a system in which Thai elites, almost all of them Bangkok-based, were rather good at log rolling and sharing sharing the fruits, shall we say, of the political system. That is, the contracts and the benefits of government. That seems to me to have evaporated. That's the single thing that will be the most difficult to rebuild. You can't conceive of Suntep or Sonti bedding down in the same political party with some of Thaksin's people. It's not impossible, but it is a much more low probability event than it's been in the past.
You talk about political leadership that Thailand sort of needed in Southeast Asia. And I was in Laos in 2009, and my Lao counterparts saying, like, looking at TV, and I think the parliamentary debate was actually like Laos' second most favorite TV program. So I think Lao people sort of really enjoy that Thai parliamentary debate. So my question is that we are surrounded by the so-called, I think Professor Weiss would be saying this, like quasi or semi-authoritarian regimes. Are we seeing that as a model for Thailand as well? And my second question to Professor Jackson, you were talking about the compromise, and 4 years ago you were sitting down with Thaksin and saying, like, Thaksin will accept the deal if he's barred from, allowed to return to Thailand, but he will be banned from running for any future political position. Do you think that deal will still go, Thaksin will still accept that deal, considering that last couple of years, when Yingluck was in government, he was the one that put Yingluck in government, and he so many times referred to Yingluck's government as my government, but sometimes he say, oh, no, my sister's government. So I was wondering whether Thaksin would still accept the deal, considering that he did what he did to Yingluck and to Thailand. Thank you.
Whether or not looking around at its neighbors and seeing semi-authoritarian systems could be a model for Thailand or appeal to Thailand, there are certainly those in the Bangkok elite who would love to use such a model. But no, I don't. It's not a sustainable model. And I think that's region-wide. There's been, over the last 6 months or so, really since, I guess, the May elections in Malaysia last year, there's been a steady bit of doomsaying going on here in the States about the decline of democracy in Southeast Asia. I think that's premature. I think that really depends on how you define democracy. Democracy is not elections, and democracy is not even really democratic institutions. The root of sustainable consolidated democracy is the socialization of democratic norms into a populace. That is the only way you get a sustainable democracy. Otherwise, you're just going through the motions. In that sense, these are growing pains, and they could go very badly, but they are necessary growing pains. And that's not just in Thailand. Up until the last 10 years, you were not empowered if you were a Thai from the north and northeast. You face enormous hurdles linguistically and ethnically breaking into traditional Thailand, the south and around Bangkok. You never had elites who really listened to you. The reasons they vote for Thailand, Thaksin, yes, he's populist, and yes, his programs were corrupt and they might have broken the bank. But if you live in northern Thailand, you've never been better off economically. It's the first time a politician ever did anything to promote education or healthcare or economic growth in the north. So that sends a message, and it empowers a new generation of Thais. I think you are seeing the exact same thing across the border in Cambodia, and you are even seeing it in Malaysia. Yes, Malaysia is going to hell in a handbasket right now with racial divides as stark as they've ever been, but the fact is, the ruling coalition also lost their first ever election last year, and we keep somehow forgetting that. Oh, they lost, and look how bad things have gotten. Yes, but they lost. For the first time since independence, the people actually woke up enough to try to vote out these guys. So
note that they're still in power.
They are still in power. As I said, clearly it's not the institutions and the elections that count. But I mean, all of this are the growing pains you have to go through to get from a democracy in name only to a fully consolidated democracy.
Apart from the inevitable growing pains of trying to institutionalize or socialize people toward a democratic comportment or commitment to democratic behaviors, there's this other factor of it's not as though there are competing alternatives being presented. There is the status quo, which right now is simply not tenable. There is no real status quo beyond chaos, right? Or there's an uncertain next thing. And so in that sense, it's not as though Yingluck has made claims toward, for instance, trying to cut back on institutions of representation and voice in order to start to put in place a more electoral authoritarian leaning order. Or that the other side, the SUTAP, has argued something similar. This council that's been called for is flat out non-democratic. And so it could be a possible landing point, but it doesn't seem to be by design if that's where things end up.
The one thing that both sides agree on from your description of the Asia Foundation poll is they want power. Yeah, they want power, and they define power personally, in personal terms. Yingluck out, Thaksin not in. And that sounds like the old Thailand, the one that's always been there. And the problem is, as Greg said, times have changed. Thaksin irrevocably changed Thai politics by mobilizing the North and the Northeast into politics. And I think it reminds me of politics in the American South in the bad old days when only white people were allowed to vote, and populist characters ran most of the southern states, and they stayed in office a very long time, and they gathered really devoted followings that lasted for generations. The Longs in Louisiana are the perfect example. And I think the real reason why the Bangkok elite, however you want to call them, the Bangkok establishment, the people of the Bangkok middle class, their real problem with going back to one man, one vote democracy is they're going to lose. And that's a problem. Do I think Thaksin would now accept the deal? Probably not. Did I believe him when he told me he would accept the deal? Maybe. But my problem is I've known a lot of American politicians, and I haven't taken everything they've ever told me to be the God's truth.
Meredith, Greg, Karl, thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you all for joining us. Please thank our panel.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.